Thanks very much for being here today. It's great to see you all, and thanks very much to Trans Pride Dublin for asking us to speak here. I'm speaking on behalf of the Sex Workers Alliance Ireland, or SWAY. We really appreciate that Trans Pride Dublin is marking the links between trans rights and sex worker rights, and also with abortion rights. And all three issues have a huge amount in common. They all follow the same themes of bodily autonomy and face a lot of the same problems in terms of patriarchal attitudes, paternalistic attitudes towards people's bodies, and the assumption that authority figures in various different arenas can decide for people better than themselves what is best for their body, what is best for them and their lives. The same thing happens to trans people, the same thing happens to people who are pregnant, the same thing happens to sex workers. In the last year, we've had a spate of hate crimes in Ireland. Many of you will have heard of recently attacks in the Midlands, a woman attacked in Northern Ireland, a stone thrown through the window of Panty Bar. We've also had a spate of attacks on sex workers, particularly trans sex workers, in the last year since the Sexual Offences Act 2017 came into effect. And it's appropriate that we're here in Fairview Park, where Declan Flynn was murdered many years ago, that we talk about hate crimes. We talk about the impact that these hate crimes are having in Ireland in the last year. Even 2 years, 3 years after the marriage equality referendum, we're still seeing very high rates of violence in Ireland. And since the Sexual Offences Act came in last year, which changed the laws regarding sex work in Ireland, there's been a 50% increase in crimes committed against sex workers and a 76% increase in violent crimes committed against sex workers. Trans sex workers have taken the brunt of this, particularly trans sex workers who are people of colour in Ireland. And last year the new Sexual Offences Act was promoted as decriminalising sex workers and criminalising clients of sex workers, and that would protect sex workers themselves. In fact, that's not the case at all. There was a small offence brought in for clients of sex workers, was a €500 fine, whereas for sex workers themselves, if they work together indoors from the same apartment for safety, which a lot of people want to do, they'll get a 12-month prison sentence or a €5,000 fine. That was doubled from what the sentences were before that piece of legislation. It was €2,500 fine or 6 months in prison. But every party in the Oireachtas, unfortunately, bar a couple of independents, supported that act. And in the last year, there's been several violent attacks with knives and robberies against trans sex workers in Dublin, because people now know that they're more likely to be working on their own, they're more likely to be vulnerable, they have less time to negotiate condom use and other safety precautions with clients, and so they're more vulnerable to being attacked thanks to that new law. So there's still a huge amount of work to do, even as this year we're celebrating the fact that we're finally getting some bodily autonomy for people who are pregnant. We're not getting that, unfortunately, yet for sex workers, and still trans people struggle against the same issues. The idea that some authority figure, whether it's a doctor or a politician or a guard or someone, a judge, knows better for you what's in your best interests, knows what will make you happy, what will make you safe, better than you know yourselves. It's the same issue that's facing people in reproductive health campaigns, in trans rights campaigns, and in sex worker campaigns. So we really appreciate being here to talk to you about that today, and to talk about the violence that trans sex workers in Ireland are experiencing. We hope that you will stand with us in solidarity and help us fight against that. Next year, just as there was a review process for the Gender Recognition Act that happened this year, there will be a review process next year on the Sexual Offences Bill, and we'll be campaigning to overturn the criminalisation of sex workers in those laws. And we would ask you also to keep in mind, when people talk about providing exit strategies for sex workers, or talking about providing services for trans people, those services and supports need to be designed around the input of the people who are going to be using those services themselves, not other people who have an opinion about what would be best for them. When it comes to trans healthcare, we have to listen to trans people. When it comes to supports for sex workers, we need to listen to sex workers, not to other people who have opinions about sex workers or trans people. And it's no coincidence that an awful lot of the people who campaign very vocally and very aggressively against trans rights also campaign vocally and aggressively against sex workers' rights, because really what they're against is bodily autonomy. They're against people getting to decide what to do with their own bodies and their own lives. And the solutions that are put forward, they're not the kind of things like free, accessible, comprehensive healthcare for trans people, so that trans people don't feel forced into sex work in order to be able to afford good healthcare. Or they mean giving people free education, not putting third level fees that make it harder for people to get an education, or allowing rent prices to go up so much that people are forced out of their homes or are made homeless by a law that says two sex workers can't be together to keep each other safe, and are kicked out of their apartment by their landlord in the middle of a housing crisis. So there are a huge number of similarities and parallels between sex worker rights and trans rights, and we'd like you to join us next year as we campaign to fight for both trans and sex worker rights. Thank you very much.